Greetings, hello, and a very, very warm welcome to all the participants and listeners of this English recording of our Arabic webinar, which is going live at this time. Maybe you are listening to this recording later, but in case you have and you are joining us live, I must share that the live webinar will be taking questions and answers. And in case you have any questions that you would be interested to ask, you are most welcome to note these down and join us back in the live webinar, which is being hosted on Zoom. As we continue our journey in increasing awareness on pacifier protection. This is part of the same series. For those of you who may have joined us for the first time, I will give a brief background about our company. Our company, Thomas Bell-Wright International Consultants, has been based here in Dubai since the last 26 years. We started off as a curtain wall mock-up testing laboratory, offering facade consulting services as well. A little over a decade ago, we started doing fire testing, starting with a single 3 meter by 3 meter vertical furnace for fire resistance tests and reaction to fire tests as per the American standard ASTM E84. Over the years, we added a large number of test apparatuses ranging from small scale reaction to fire tests as per American and European test methods, as well as the large scale fire tests for fire propagation of facades and cladding materials. We also added 3 more fire resistance furnaces, and today we boast to be one of the largest fire testing laboratories in terms of capability and spread of equipment and spread of test methods. Our 4 meters by 5 meters vertical furnace and our 4 meters by 5 meters horizontal furnace are both load bearing, and we are accredited to testing as per American, British, European, ISO, NFPA, as well as some Indian test methods. So coming back to what this journey has been about, this journey has been driven mainly by the Saudi building code being published in 2018. And as we talk through and increase awareness on matters related to pacifier protection, use of pacifier protection, as well as compliance and conformity, we have already undertaken 3 such sessions. We started with giving an introduction of the first chapter, talking about scope and applicability of the code, as well as giving an overview of compliance concepts. We then talked about occupancy concepts and an overview of what is active fire protection and passive fire protection. The last webinar was on chapter 7, which talked about fire resistance tests and what are the practical usages and intricacies related to implementation of passive fire protection, specifically compartmentalization and fire resistance. Today, we move a little further in and we talk about interior finishing, and we talk about the chapter 8, which focuses specifically and heavily about interior finishes of buildings of different types of occupancy. Later, next month, we will also be focusing on the chapter 14, and we will be talking about facades and fire safety requirements related to the building envelope. The chapter 8 of the Saudi Building Code focuses on interior finishing requirements, and I will begin with a very brief overview of what all we have covered till now. We talked about the introduction and how many different codes that have been published, starting not only from the fire code, but an existing building code, green building code, and so on and so forth. We also covered about conformity and compliance regimes, talking about how compliance requirements are detailed in the code and how the implementation of compliance, both of materials that are used as well as methodologies of construction and installation, can be assured. Some products and materials have stringent regulations in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and these regulations are implemented by Saudi Standards Metrology and Quality Organization, better known as SASO, and they have their product conformity programs as well as pre-shipment inspection programs, better known as per the SABER system and the GEAM Saudi quality mark. But an extremely large number of materials and products are not covered by any mandatory regulation in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and hence anybody could get such building materials onto a project. And this is where the private third-party certification marks provide a very high degree of assurance and ensuring that your risks are covered. We started and also covered in the previous sessions an extremely important concept of occupancy and occupancy type, and how different types of buildings, whether they are an assembly or a factory or a residential area or an institution, have been grouped together in order to help write and implement the code. Throughout the course of the code, and as we will see today as well, these occupancy types provide the base criteria as well as the requirements, which will help group the compliance requirements into maybe lower or higher or very high stringent levels of requirements. In the past sessions, we have introduced what is fire protection and how passive fire protection concepts are utilized to bring about a very high degree of fire protection and making sure that the lives as well as property are not damaged or lives are not lost. We did already talk about fire resistance, and today we focus on reaction to fire. We all remember that in case there is a fire and the fire is compartmentalized and closed within the location where it may have been initiated, is checked in by fire resistance. But in the same go, we also need to be very careful that in case a fire does initiate, the fire does not grow very quickly, does not spread very quickly, as well as does not produce a lot of smoke. In order to prevent this movement and growth of fire is why we are here talking today about these requirements as per the chapter 8, which is on interior finishing. What is the chapter 8? The chapter 8 talks about interior finish, decorative materials, and furnishings. Let's start with the few definitions which are there at the beginning of the chapter. We start with a very basic property, flame spread. What is flame spread? It is the quantification of the propagation of flame over the surface of any given material. The flame spread index, on the other hand, is a comparative measure expressed in a dimensionless number derived from visual measurements of the flame spread versus time for a material tested in accordance to the ASTM E84 or the UL723 test method. In the same lines, a comparative measure, again expressed as a dimensionless number derived from measurements of smoke obscuration versus the time for a material tested as per ASTM E84, is called as the smoke developed index. And then there is the interior floor wall base. The interior floor finish trim used to provide a functional or a decorative border at the intersection of floors and walls is called as the interior floor wall base. We also have something which is used through the chapter as the stretch fabricated site stretched site fabricated stretch system, which is a system that is intended for acoustical, tackleable, or aesthetic purposes, and it is composed of 3 elements. And these 3 elements, as you can also see on your screen, are used to create this system, which is comprised of a frame, a core material, as well as an outside layer, which could be a textile, a vinyl, or a fabric that is stretched in place to provide the tension. Now we move towards what this chapter talks about and which are the groupings that this chapter is going to detail about. We will learn about the requirements of the interior wall and ceiling finish and trims in existing buildings. This is very interesting and important to know that as this code has been introduced almost afresh in a market where construction has existed since a very, very long time, properties have existed since a very, very long time, and in order to ensure a very high degree of fire safety, the code publishes some requirements which are for existing buildings. We also have another section which again talks about the interior wall and ceiling trim and interior floor finishing as well, but this is for new and existing buildings. And then the chapter continues to define other aspects of what goes inside occupancy, upholstered furniture, mattresses, both in new and existing buildings. We all love green, and in order to do so, more and more decorative vegetation is being brought in inside new as well as existing buildings, and the chapter details what these requirements are. The decorative requirements for materials which are other than these decorative vegetations are also defined in new as well as existing buildings. And then whatever else is left, which is quite a bit, is also defined in this chapter 8 of the Saudi Building Code. How these code requirements are defined are using what we talked about in the past, that what is the occupancy type, which means that when we are looking at defining specific requirements of materials which can be used on the interiors of any type of occupancy, the limits set are defined on the basis of the occupancy type. As explained in the past, The occupancy type usually has a lot of linked information in terms of the behavior of users of those occupancy type, their awareness levels, their preparedness levels for fire safety, as well as matters related to how a fire department is aware of and is taking care of these occupancies. So with this as the base information, as well as other information in terms of the fire resistance ratings and the type which we defined in the previous webinar when we talked about fire resistance, that what is the fire resistance rating in terms of types of building we defined, or the code defines the type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4, type 5, and how the fire resistance rating in terms of hours is maintained. With these two pieces of information put together, we arrive at the various different requirements. As an example, 805, which talks about mattresses, will look at group I2 or institutional requirements for nursing homes and hospitals. It will define a separate requirement for mattresses to be used in institutional occupancies. And so on, there are various definitions where the limits set for what kind of materials that are being used internally and what are the testing and compliance requirements which are being set in place use primarily these two groupings of information to arrive at what is allowed and what should not be allowed in order to successfully implement the fire safety strategy or the prescriptive ideology of the code, which has been evolving for decades and decades now from the United States. There is also a very good reference table which defines the requirements of various occupancies for sprinklered and non-sprinklered buildings. And I would urge all of you who are interested to understand this better to go pick up your copy of the code and read through in order to get exact and detailed information. As alluded earlier as well, this webinar series is not a series specifically to teach all the aspects of the building codes. These webinars are focused as introducing the concepts and utilization of the code in order for a better understanding of passive fire protection as well as compliance of materials which ensure fire safety. Let's dig a little deeper into each of the section when we talk about what it is. What all gets covered in interior wall and ceiling finish and trim in existing buildings. These are fire retardant coatings, textiles, expanded vinyl wall or ceiling coverings, facings of wood veneers which are applied on site, foam plastic materials, HDPE high density polyethylene and high density polypropylene materials, as well as defined in the definition section, the site fabricated stretch systems. This section points to 4 different test methods and defines the requirements for these types of materials for existing as well as new buildings. We will detail and touch upon these test methods in the last part of today's session. 804, which talks about the same interior walls, ceilings, as well as floors in existing as well as new buildings. We talk about interior trims, foam plastic, new interior foam finish, floor finish, and interior floor wall base. This section again points towards 4 different test methods and defines different requirements based on, as mentioned earlier, occupancy type as well as type of construction. We have the upholstered furniture and mattresses section, which again points towards 3 different test methods defining what are the requirements for various occupancy type. The decorative vegetation, which is almost not very new, but new it's something that has been picking up, considers natural cut trees or cut plants, which may be used internally as decoration. It also considers and defines the requirements for artificial vegetation. Again, this points to 2 different test methods, NFPA 289 and NFPA 701. Now, there are a lot of other materials which are used as decorative materials indoors, inside, and this is not necessarily decorative vegetation. We talk about combustible decorative material. What are foam plastics? What are the requirements when foam plastics are being used? Motion picture screens, and how pyroxylin plastic is not allowed to be used in the interiors, and what are the requirements for artwork. This section uses the NFPA 289 and NFPA 701 as test methods to define the constraints of what is allowed and what is not allowed. The last section covers all those which are probably not covered yet. It has a requirement for certain occupancy type for waste baskets and linen containers, signages of various types, as well as combustible lockers. It uses 3 test methods, the ASTM E84, the NFPA 289, as well as the UL 1315 to define requirements. What requirements? Well, requirements related to reaction to fire. What is reaction to fire? Well, it answers the very basic question that does the material catch fire or not? This can be answered in many ways. This can be checked in many ways. And a lot of people sometimes come up with very innovative ways with a cigarette lighter or a blowtorch to find out whether the material catches fire or not. But I think we need to look at this in a very definitive way, where we need to be sure that there is repeatability of various types of materials when we are trying to validate and quantify the reaction to fire properties of various materials. But what are we looking at? We need to make sure that a small fire incident does not become a big fire accident when there could be an initiation of fire due to something small, like a kitchen fire or a burning matchstick falling down or a piece of shisha coal or oud, or any one of several possible risks that exist on the inside of specific occupancies. And you would all understand and agree that the risk of initiation of a fire inside a residential apartment will always be very, very different from the risk of the initiation of fire inside a mall, inside a hospital, inside a factory, or a commercial office complex, or a place of worship, etc., etc., etc. This is exactly the reason why the concept of occupancy type is the concept which helps to define these requirements. We usually group the reaction to fire properties as 4 different quantifiable variables. We can define ignitability, we can define the calorific value, we can define combustibility, and we can define the flame and smoke spread. And based on these quantifiable parameters, often the requirements are set in place when it comes to standards, codes, as well as technical regulations and technical specifications, which often create the binding legal or commercial requirements in contracts. Let us look at the test methods that are referenced in the chapter 8 of the Saudi Fire Code. The most used test method, which is the ASTM E84, helps to define and quantify a flame spread and a smoke developed index. Another test method, which is the NFPA 253, is the critical radiant flux meter measurement of floor coverings and system. As the spread of floor types and floor coverings increase across various occupancies, right from customized carpets to floors which are having various types of coatings, this test is an extremely important and well-used test method. We also have the calorimeter, which is the ASTM E1354, which quantifies the heat and visible smoke release rates for materials as well as products. The list continues to the 16 CFR part 1634, which talks about the flammability of mattresses and mattress pads. And we continue our list and we move towards the ASTM D 2859, which quantifies the ignition characteristics of finished textile floor covering materials. ASTM E 1537 talks about upholstered furniture, E1590 again about mattresses, and the NFPA 265 is a room fire growth contribution of textile or expanded vinyl wall coverings. The 286, the NFPA 286 is a test method for evaluating the contribution of wall and ceiling interior finish to a room fire growth. Now, as you can see, we are talking about how a small initiation of fire can cause a big fire, and these test methods help to quantify such behavior of material. The NFPA 289 talks about individual fuel packages and what is the fuel level. NFPA 701 again is a test method which is very often used for defining textile and films and their flame propagation characteristics. This test method is referenced and used for many different types of textiles as well as tents, etc. The NFPA 703 is the fire retardant treated wood and the fire retardant coatings for building materials. The 260 is specifically focused at the cigarette ignition resistance of the components of upholstered furniture. The 261 is the resistance of mock-up of upholstered furniture, material assemblies to ignition by smoldering cigarettes. The UL 1315 is a standard for the safety of metal waste paper containers. Now, we may not be able to go in great details to all these test methods, but let me take the first three today in this session, and we will go a little deeper to better understanding how these test methods work. I start with the ASTM E84. This is also called the Steiner tunnel test, named behind the person who started this test method. This test method uses two reference materials, a cement board as well as a red oak wood, to create two limits of smoke developed index and flame spread index. The smoke developed index and the flame spread index of a cement board is quantified as 0, 0 as a number, and the flame spread index and the smoke developed index as a number of is quantified as 100 and 100 for red oak wood. Now, any material that requires to be quantified in its behavior is laid into this test equipment, as you can see, and with the ignition set at one corner of the Steiner tunnel, we arrive at a relative quantification or a number for various types of materials. So as you can imagine, if we are testing anything which is more combustible as compared to red oak wood, then the flame spread index and the smoke developed index will be a number much higher than 100. This test method is used for testing an extremely wide array of products and materials, and the classification requirements which are brought out of this 10-minute test, which is a number 100 in this case, as an example of flame spread index being 100 and the smoke developed index being 950 for the sample that was tested, is utilized in different sections of the code in different ways. A HVAC segment for, I think, defining plenum material or some other material could be defining a limit of 2550, which is flame spread index should be 2550. But in case of this section and in case of the interior section, the data is defined as class ABC, which is a flame spread index of 0 to 25 for class A and B and C. And this classification is, of course, used either in creating contracts, but as I alluded, that this data is raw data in a way that it is a number, and the number can be used for arriving at a technical specification or a contract or a legal document as per the application. I now move to the critical radiant flux of flow covering systems, the NFPA 253 as a test method. You can also see a video running on the screen of how in this equipment a sample of the flooring is loaded. The standard was developed to simulate an important fire exposure component in fires that develops in corridors or exit enclosures. The fire test response in this standard is designed to provide for a basis of estimating only one aspect of fire exposure behavior of floor covering system installed in a building. And the test environment simulates conditions that have been observed in defined in full scale corridor experiments. What does this test actually do? It creates a radiant heat flux and tests the ability of flooring materials on how, because of radiated heat, can the flooring catch fire? And if it does catch fire, how much can this fire cause a damage? The value which is calculated is the average critical radiant heat flux, and based on the code requirements, a classification grouping is created of the average critical radiant flux as class 1 or class 2. Class 1 is considered as a better class than class 2, as the sample is able to sustain a higher heat flux. We then move to the calorimeter, and what the calorimeter does is that it takes a very small piece of sample and arrives at several parameters in quantifying the heat release, etc. What you can see on your screens here is the 3 specimens that have been tested, and the test results captures a lot of things like the heat release ratio, total heat release, what has been the peak irradiance, the peak heat release, and the incident heat flux. What you see from section 808.2 is the requirements that have been set in. As you would see that the requirements are for group R2, and it says that the peak heat release ratio should not exceed 300 kilowatt per meter square when the incident heat flux is 50 kilowatt per meter square. Now, moving to what I had described earlier is conformity requirements. And we all know that most of the materials which are defined in the code as materials that can potentially cause a big fire accident if they are not within the limits that have been defined in the code, the means of conformity is third-party certification in most of the cases. The third-party certification and listing is a concept that we have covered several times in previous presentations, and we ensure that by means of a very stringent mechanism and system in place, there is a very high degree of assurance of materials that are received at site. This starts typically when the certification body goes to the manufacturer's premises and samples or witnesses the manufacturing of a given material. And this sampled material, which has been witnessed for manufacturing processes, is marked, and the marked sample is then sent to the laboratory to test against the specific test methods. And only in case of a successful test is the next step of the regular audit regime that starts. Now, the audit goes back and checks that there is a quality management system or a system in place that is able to demonstrate repeatability of production of that given product or material in a factory or in a manufacturing location. And such a product which is produced under that mechanism is given an authorization to use a certification mark or a number which is unique to that product line and that manufacturing location. And this certification mark hence provides the traceability and identification of such material at the site where it has been procured or is being inspected. Now, this is an extremely helpful tool of assurance, which means the product, when received at the construction site, can be looked up to check whether the material actually complied to the requirements which were probably declared in an information brochure. What do you do? Well, not just a basic piece of test report as an evidence, the evidence which could come out of some product produced in some factory and tested at some time, the certification process provides a methodology of review. If you go to the certification body's directory and look up the certification number, or probably even the manufacturer, you would be able to see what is the product, where is it manufactured, in what form factor, as well as look at the markings on the product. And this hence provides a very, very high degree of assurance, which is badly needed when it comes to implementation of very, very strict requirements that will ensure the fire and life safety of buildings. This brings me towards the end of today's session. If you are listening in live, I would welcome you all back to the Zoom meeting. Please rush back, and in case you have not registered, the link would be available to you, and you can go back into the meeting now and either ask your questions or benefit from the questions and answers of other attendees.